All right, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name's Kurt Thomas. I'm one of the research scientists at Google. And today I want to talk about protecting accounts from credential stuffing. And after the last talk, that's in any language. So the motivation for our work is that in the last couple of years, billions of stolen credentials have become widely available. And this is because dumps at former sites have become repackaged and redistributed in underground forums. So we have this headline from Wired recently, just back in January, where there are 2.2 billion passwords that can be downloaded all in one go right now. The challenge here is that this trivializes hijacker access to accounts. If a user Alice happens to reuse their password on, say, their email site, their cloud storage, and their finance site, all of those resources become accessible to the hijacker via credential stuffing attack. And this is more than just like a hypothetical problem. We've done some research in the past where we found that accounts that have had a password leaked in a third-party breach are 10 times more likely to go on to be hijacked. Now at Google, we rely on a defense in depth strategy to defend against this type of attack. We use risk analysis to actually block hundreds of thousands of automated hijacking attempts every day. And we also search for password breaches and proactively reset users that are part of those breaches. But the problem we're actually trying to solve then is how do you actually protect the long tail of sites and all of the users across the web? And here it's fundamentally a problem of an asymmetry of knowledge. On the one hand, we have attackers with access to billions of usernames and passwords. And on the other hand, we have users and identity providers that are unaware of what's going on and don't have resources to actually address this problem. Now, there are services right now that try to bridge this knowledge gap. So Have I Been Pwned is a prominent one, where you can go look up your email and they'll tell you what breaches that you've been part of. But there's some challenges here. One is a risk of inaccurate advice. So if you look up just your username, if you've already happened to change your password, you're still going to get the same advice that you were part of a breach. And if you were compromised on site X but happen to reuse your password on site Y and Z, you're not going to get any advice that you need to go and remediate there as well. And also, when you use these types of services, there's actually a privacy risk of what data you share with them. You may be giving them your plain text username, and some services just do like SHA-1 hash of your password. So all of that actually exposes you risk if the breach alerting service happens to be an adversary. So today, the research that I'm going to cover is really how can we do better and build a privacy-preserving protocol for detecting whether you've been in a breach, and go beyond just designing a protocol and actually do a real-world deployment where we had 667,000 participants actually go and use this, and lessons we learned from what's the state of credentials in the wild. So as we talk about password breaches, and it's a huge part of this research, I want to give a note on ethics that just because data has been exposed and widely available now on the internet doesn't mean we as researchers can just do whatever we want with that data. So the context of why we're looking at this and collecting it is really to help re-secure users because we know there's a real threat out there. But any protocol we do that amplifies access to this information has to be designed with abuse from a ground principle. So that led us to think of like, what are the principles that we need to bake into any sort of breach alerting protocol? And the first we came up with is that we want democratized access. If we're going to solve this for the long tail of the internet and all the different identity providers and users, they need to be able to tap into this technology. The second is that we really want to focus on actionable, not informational things that we can pass to the user. So when you're in a breach and you've had your password exposed, you can actually go and reset that. And that's a simple step that we can give to users and advice we can pass on to them. If your phone number was in a breach or your mailing address in a breach, there's not a simple step we can say, oh, you should do this now. It's just informational. So we consider that out of scope for the protocol we're designing. The other thing is that user attention is incredibly precious and a limited resource. So how do we get them to focus on breach passwords, not just weak passwords? So in our context, we only care about triggering on when your exact username and password is exposed, not just because you use a password like chocolate1, which is the top 1,000th password in our corpus. We think a password strength meter is better to handle that. We want to focus people first on the most predominant threat that we know is out there. And the last is that we need the protocol to be near real time. Like there are very fancy privacy and crypto primitives that are available, but that may not be tenable for a solution when you need to integrate into a login flow or give a warning as soon as somebody signs into a website. So I'm going to cover some of the details of how we designed this protocol, but I will refer you to the paper for like the full construction of what we're trying to accomplish. But it's very simplest. What we're trying to do is say, you have a username and password as a user. We want you to query our service that happens to know usernames and passwords that are in breaches and return you a bit whether or not you've actually been in that breach. But we need to take into account both an adversarial client who's abusing the system, as well as an adversarial server who's trying to learn a user's username and password. In the context of an adversarial client, one of the simple things we can do is rely on a proof of work. So we can just slow you down such that you can't brute force the API and try a bunch of different usernames and passwords. Here we use Argon2 as a hash to accomplish this, and this has a nice side benefit of were our storage system to ever be breached, it's also secure against any type of attack. So there's no benefit of going via the API or directly attacking our service. The amount of work you have to do is the same in either context. The more challenging problem is how do we actually protect you as a user from revealing any secret information to the service? And there's a lot of different techniques that are available here. We settled on private set intersection. And the idealized example of this is kind of like a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. A user has a secret A that only they know, and they're going to encrypt their username and password, the hash of that, and send it to the service. That's meaningless to the service, but what we can do on the flip side is take a secret that only the service knows, encrypt all the records that we have access to, and then basically provide you a secret index into that database that you need to look up. So there's a lot more details about how this works in the paper, but this is kind of the high-level instrument of how do you do a secret lookup without revealing what you're actually looking up. But this is idealized. The challenge is right now you have to pass back the entire database back to the user, which is billions of records, so hundreds of gigabytes of data. This is not tenable in practice. So what we can do is actually weaken private set intersection to be a k-anonymity problem. If you're willing to reveal in this construction some bits of a hash of your username, we can actually partition that whole database of usernames and passwords we know on breaches just to one that you're guaranteed to be in if your username happens to be in one of the breaches. And so the trade-off we selected was if you're willing to leak 2 bytes of your username prefix, which amounts to about a k-anonymity of roughly 60,000 users, then you can learn you're in a breach, and the consequence is you only have to download about 1 to 2 megabytes of data, which we think is okay for a desktop-style environment, which we were targeting as our first cut. The other last attack I want to talk about is denial of service. We don't want to expose our service to basically being shut down because the attacker gets angry with us. So what we opted to do here is instead of dynamically selecting a key that the server would use, we actually used a fixed key, and we can rotate it when we need to. But this then turns us into a static serving problem, which is great from actually an engineering standpoint and building the service out. So nearly all of the work is being done on the client. The only thing the server has to do is do some cryptographic signing when a request comes in. So we wanted to build this in practice, and what we opted doing is a Chrome extension as a first cut pass for like a prototype. So the idea is as you type in your username and password, the extension would identify that data, would do all the encryption, and then on the flip side, the server, we created it as a cloud function. So it's serverless, it scales automatically to the number of clients that are going to be using the system, and all we have to do is then connect to a cloud storage and decide, hey, you passed us this username prefix, which bucket do we need to look in to serve you any data back, and then everything else is handled on the client. In terms of where we're getting all of our data, we have 4 billion usernames and passwords that have been exposed in breaches. These are across sites in the US, in Europe, in China, Vietnam, across the world. If you're interested in how we actually do this in an ongoing process, we have a paper a couple years ago at CCS, which goes into the details of like how do you go find these on underground forums, clean up the data, and things like that. So we're going to try something which is very risky. We're going to actually demo this. So I have in my upper right corner, this is our extension, actually live. It's called Password Checkup. And this is GitHub, which is one of the properties we were concerned about for developers. So I'm going to use a username and password. This is one that happens to be in a breach. So what's happening right now in the background, in the upper right, blue icon, it's thinking, it's encrypting your username and password. It's then coming up with that hash prefix, sends it to the server, and gets a response. And because this is in a breach, we then display a warning in the browser that says, hey, you need to change your password. We give users options. If for some reason it's a mistake or it's like a low value account to them, they can ignore it. Otherwise, they can close it. And then also up here, what we have here is that now there's a warning that if you ever need to go back and find what that password was, your GitHub account was exposed, go and change the password. So that's the very light detail. If you want to try this out, it's available in the Chrome Web Store. You can kind of go demo on your own pages and things like that. One thing we wanted to do, though, to kind of prove the value of this is that we had to extend the protocol to actually connect some anonymous telemetry. So when you log in, one of the things we collect is, did you actually receive a breach warning? And how long did it actually do to do the proof of work and the round trip time involved there? If users opt to ignore it, we want to know, because is the warning actually being effective and adhered to, or are people like having problems with the process? And the last is, if you change your password, we can actually automatically detect that right now with the extension. And we look at both the strength before and after to see, are we nudging people to better security moving forward? So we actually deployed this in practice back in February, and there was a huge uptick, way more than we were expecting. We told people it was an experiment that they could be involved in if they wanted, and we had 667,000 users in the very first month. Thankfully, like as I said, as we designed this to be static serving and via Cloud Functions, we were able to go from just our internal beta testers of like 100 people in February 5th and automatically scale to hundreds of thousands of users over the course of just a day or two, where we hit a peak of about 20 QPS. And the total query time that like from typing in your password to finally seeing a warning was about 8.5 seconds. And half of that is spent in the proof of work, so that's by design. The other is right now you have to download that 1 to 2 megabytes of data, so that's something we'd love to potentially improve in the future and looking for help from folks in the audience to do that. What's interesting about the extension, though, and the protocol is it actually provides us a lens into the ecosystem of what's the state of password security. So we scanned about 21 million logins over the course of that 1 month period. During that time, we identified 316,000 passwords as being breached. So roughly 1 in 2 users would have seen a warning, we estimate. We don't have actual identifiers, so we can only estimate. But what we can say is that 1.5% of all logins on the web right now are relying on breached passwords. And we think this is a lower bound. You know, we have a security tech-savvy audience that was installing the extension, so they're already prone probably not to reusing passwords. And there's some other details we go into the paper as to why we think this is higher than it actually is. The other thing is we can actually see where is this threat most prominent. So even on some of the most sensitive pages like government and finance and email, we're seeing relatively high volumes of password reuse. And these ratios look fairly small, but when you scale this out to billions of users, these are tens of millions of people who are at risk of having their account hijacked. But even more so, it's that long tail of the internet where this is happening. So on shopping sites where you may have credit card details stored, news sites with subscriptions, and your entertainment properties, this is where we see up to 6.3% of all logins to those pages being vulnerable to hijacking. Now, we didn't just want to study the state of passwords, we actually wanted to make them better. And so with our warnings, 26% of users actually went on to go and resecure their password. And this is lower than we were hoping for, but there's a lot of things that are going on here. You can have, one, an uneasy path. Like our warning doesn't usher you to the account reset page, because we don't know where that is for all of the pages across the internet. The other challenge is that some people may have shared accounts. You don't necessarily, if you have like a Netflix account with your partner, you can't necessarily change the password even though it may be weak. So I think there's work to be done here, but 26% was a great first cut for us actually seeing positive change from these warnings. And even better, we were able to measure the password strength and say that 94% of users at least adopted a password that was as strong or stronger than it was before. And about 60% of them are in the safely unguessable range by ZXCVBN standards, which means it takes about 100 million guesses before you would be able to crack that password. So in terms of takeaways that I'd love the audience to have, is that this privacy-preserving breach alerting protocol actually has the potential to help millions of users from account hijacking. But we'd actually love your help in making this more real, which is you could share breaches with us to make this more access to more users to get the word out there. You can help us improve the protocol for low-end devices. So if you're a cryptographer or you're working in hardware enclaves or things like that, we're open to ideas of how do we actually reduce the computational bounds on the protocol. And if you work in the UX space, how do we actually ease this process of doing account recovery or even designing warnings to alert people to the most sensitive actions that they should take on their account? So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks very much. Let's get some questions.
All right, Qiao from Rice University. This is great work. I cannot wait for testing my password is breached or not. I will do it later. One quick question is that suppose I use centralized password management service like 1Password. I can imagine they could also provide similar services. So for me, a user which is more secure, how can you help me decide which service is better?
Well, so there's two parts to this, I think. One is we designed the API to be open. So even if you use a password manager, you could potentially go and integrate this as part of your service to get this type of advice. As for which password manager to use, any is great to start. Like the vast majority of users right now don't use one. So if you think of the advice that we could give people, we're so far on the spectrum right now of just saying let's address breaches. Then we can worry about reuse and using automated or stronger passwords, and then go from there to two-factor authentication. So advice is a spectrum. We're starting with the biggest problem that we see right now.
All right, thanks.
Let's go to the back, Mike.
Hi, thanks. Nick Nikiforakis, Stony Brook. Because of your implementation with the browser extension, are there any issues with fingerprintability? Because you're injecting this warning. Could the site learn something about the user being involved in in a compromise that they wouldn't know before?
Yeah, so the way we rationalized this threat model was the site that we're injecting into already has access to username and password. So the risk of us exposing any additional details is fairly small. The challenge we had, and there's much to do in improving the UI, is we wanted an in-context warning that was associated with the action you just took. And browser extensions don't provide a great mechanism. But you could imagine that service itself could integrate and provide the warning post-login. So this is a first cut pass for us. We think there's a lot of ways to improve it, and we'd love suggestions on how to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Goldberg from 1Password. We do actually integrate not with this, but with Have I Been Pwned for. So we're using Have I Been Pwned, and I was very interested in your choice for the breach not weak, because that is. I'll let you comment on that. I've got opinions, but
yeah. So. Our philosophy was, like I said, user attention is a precious resource. So how do we get them to focus on the largest problem? And some of the research we've done in the past is it's not guessing attacks that online are happening very often. There is evidence of that, but it's this kind of password washing where you just try one username, one password, you go through everything that's in the breach that's netting the most victims. So we were like, let's solve that. Weak passwords are probably the next thing that you have to address, but can we at least make a dent in this problem first? So, yeah.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more quick questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nivina from Facebook. Thank you for the fascinating work. I was wondering whether you did any UX research prior to releasing this. What were the results and how did they vary across different population tech savviness?
Yeah,
as a
so
criteria?
We didn't have the expertise to do all of the UX research that we wanted. What we tried to model was after safe browsing and taking all the lessons that they had. So having a very actionable thing you saw with our warning was change your password. So clear next step. We had a help center page where people could learn more if they actually needed help through the process. But yes, what we'd really like to understand is once you see that warning, how hard is it for you to go to the next page and actually reset? So I think there's a ton of work to do in that domain. We're how do we do the cryptographic heavy lifting? And then the next step is how do we actually have empathy for users and walk them through this process?
Thank you.
Hi, this is Esha from Microsoft Research. So I was wondering, you said that you are collecting telemetry and whether the client is getting a breach alert or not. So I'm slightly confused with the threat model. Then if you are collecting the breach alert, then why do it on the client end at all? Why can't you just check it on the server? And why not do this communication, this entire communication heavy protocol?
So I should differentiate. The extension never sees your username and password, and that's by design. The telemetry only reveals the 1-bit status of was in a breach and some information about the password strength and some other things.
Yeah, but you're checking this, right? So this is a private set membership thing. So you can do it on the server to get the bit out. Why do you do it on the client side at all? Why do you do it at the browser?
I might have to take this offline, but like for the telemetry purposes, it was so that we could understand as a service, are we actually providing something of value? We have actually an opt-out button where users can say, I don't want to report any telemetry, and they still get all the benefit of the username and password alerting.
I see. And are you collecting the telemetry in some private way, or like some differentially private way, or just plain telemetry?
We have no user identifiers, so everything is just the 3 bits that we send along. So we can talk more if you'd like.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
Great. Let's thank the speaker again very much.
Thank you.